Right here.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill was introduced by myself and Councilmember Wells on December 20th, 2011. We had a hearing on January 30th, 2012. May 17th, the committee voted to approve the bill 5-0, and the council voted 9-4 at its June 5th legislative meeting to approve the bill. As we all know, the taxicab industry is an essential part of the district's transportation network. Taxicabs and limousines are vital to the tourist, hospitality, and business environment in the city. They provide transportation to thousands of residents every day and provide a public face for the city to millions of visitors every year. We're a world-class city, and the aim of this bill ultimately is to establish a world-class taxi industry. The committee heard many complaints about the service provided by the industry to its passengers. It's been plagued by longstanding public criticism related to performance, lax standards, lack of amenities that we see in other cities, credit cards, for example, absence of professionalism, areas that are underserved, taxicabs that are not fuel efficient or wheelchair accessible, and the experience of many has led them to conclude, and this was confirmed by a survey that I conducted of residents. More than 4,000 responses were received. 78% believed taxicab service in the district was fair or poor. 69% believed that taxicab service in the district was worse than other American cities. And 94% said that they wanted to see legislation to improve service. After many months of discussion with the Taxicab Commission, with the drivers, owners, consumer advocates, disability advocates, the hospitality industry, and Uber, the committee crafted a solution that we think will significantly improve taxicab service in the district, as well as the functioning of the commission. There are a number of improvements. We went over this last time, but I have an amendment that has a number of things related to it, and I'd like to hand that out now. Do I have that? And I'll wait till the members have a copy of this. Right, and I did circulate this to the members yesterday so that they would have it in advance, but obviously we're getting another copy now. Part of the issue about the taxicab reform bill related to the access to taxicabs for persons in the disabled community, and the first amendment deals with that. It creates this Department of Disability Services, this committee rather, that will look at access to disability to the disability community to accessible taxicabs, and that is already in the bill. But we added something that among the things that should be looked at in terms of this body and its recommendations is the means by which the district can achieve a fleet of 100% wheelchair accessible taxicabs. It would add the Office of Human Rights to the Disabled Taxicab Advisory Committee in place of the Department of Disability Services. It would update the language to include culturally sensitive words to describe the demand for accessible taxicab services, and directs the Disabled Taxicab Advisory Committee to examine how the number of accessible taxicabs could be increased and what timetable could be used. That would be the first change. The second change, and I'm on page 2 of the list here, this section would clarify the requirement for taxicab fleets to increase the number of wheelchair accessible vehicles. It would clarify that it applies to fleets owned by companies, not taxicabs owned by individual drivers, even if they may be affiliated or associated with a company. It establishes a timeline for taxi fleets to reach the 20% wheelchair accessible requirement and sets interim goals. It directs the Commission to develop a program to provide grants, loans, or other types of financial assistance and incentives to offset the cost of purchasing and operating wheelchair accessible taxicabs. The next item, number 3, would make a technical change to the description of a wheelchair accessible vehicle. Number 4, this section would clarify that an on-duty taxicab without passengers is required to stop for a person in a wheelchair attempting to hail a taxi. If the taxicab cannot transport the person in a wheelchair, The driver would be required to contact a dispatch service if it is affiliated with a company or association. The next item, number 5, would clarify companies or associations operating wheelchair-accessible taxicabs must connect those vehicles to a dispatch service. It would also require wheelchair-accessible taxicabs to grant priority to persons in wheelchairs. The next part, we had certain amendments related to Uber, and I understand there may be a further amendment, but at least as far as these amendments goes, that's now removed. Further, item number 9, this section would delete the offense of fleeing a hack inspector. Driver stated that the provision was vague and that imposing the same penalties as fleeing a police officer seemed too harsh. The committee would direct instead that this offense be considered taken up by the Committee on the Judiciary, since it would identify it as a criminal offense. The next item would clarify when the GPS system is active. There was concern by taxi operators about the GPS system being activated when they were not on duty or when they did not have passengers. It says that the GPS system to be active when the driver is without a passenger or is searching for a fare. GPS would strike that provision, and therefore the GPS would not apply at that time. Data on the location of the vehicle will still be available in real time to emergency personnel when a driver or passenger presses the emergency safety button. The next item would allow taxicabs currently in service to maintain their current color scheme. Drivers have expressed concern about the cost of repainting their taxicabs to meet the uniform color scheme that the Commission is slated to adopt under this law. This section would clarify that the new color scheme would only apply when taxicabs are retired and new vehicles enter service. This way, that cost would be absorbed as the vehicles were replaced instead of immediately. The next item would clarify the offense of loitering by public vehicles for hire. Taxicabs have been prohibited from loitering since 1985. This would expand the loitering offense to all public vehicles for hire. The existing text would make it unlawful for a driver to engage in, quote, unnecessarily slow driving, unquote. Drivers expressed concern that this language is too vague and could allow hack inspectors to abuse their authority and arbitrarily issue citations. The section would clarify the offense of loitering by public vehicles for hire by making it unlawful for drivers to, quote, drive substantially below the speed limit, unquote, and it creates a standard that would be more objective. The next item would delete the offense of refusal to pay for a taxicab. This section is being struck for consistency, as all criminal offenses are being removed from the legislation and being forwarded to the Committee on the Judiciary for its consideration. The next item would allow individual drivers to benefit from a dispatch system, and it would also clean up a typographical error. And then there are certain technical amendments that would make requirements for licensing, serving underserved areas, enforcement, and enforcement applicable to all 3 classes of vehicles, taxis, sedans, and limousines. Currently, sedans were unintentionally omitted from the 3 provisions. I also want to share news, although it's not part of these amendments, but in talking about this, just so we know, the mayor is transmitting a reprogramming today that will cover the cost of installing the new meters for the taxi operators, and therefore the only actual out-of-pocket cost to the drivers will be the cost estimated to be $150 to $200 of purchasing a uniform dome light sometime within the next year. Additionally, I have scheduled a hearing on our taxi system for Wednesday, November 14th at 11 a.m. in the council chamber, and that will give us an opportunity to quickly review these amendments, whichever ones are adopted, and the underlying bill, if it's adopted with the amendments or without the amendments. So I want people to know in advance that we plan to have a very fast look at how this is being rolled out. In any event, I would like to move the amendments at this time.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Cheh. Councilmember Evans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to Councilmember Cheh's amendment. First of all, I'd like to thank her for deleting the Uber amendments. So for all of those who have been texting us and calling us, the $15 minimum is eliminated from the bill, as Councilmember Cheh's amendment has deleted that. However, by deleting all of the Uber amendments, there's a question whether Uber is operating legally in the district or not. And the amendment I'm offering, along with Council members Michael Brown, David Catani, and Tommy Wells, what this amendment would do is ensure that Uber is operating legally. So I'll just read it. It's been circulated. It amends Section 20M by adding a new subsection C to read as follows. For purposes of this section, a business that uses a mobile phone application to connect its users to sedan service shall be exempt from regulation by the Commission, including the fares charged by the business, provided that an estimate fare is available to the user when the application is used to book a sedan. The method for calculating the fare structure is provided by the business to the user of the mobile application prior to the booking of a sedan. Upon completion of the trip, the customer is provided a receipt that lists the pickup point, drop-off point, and the total fare paid, and the business providing the mobile application uses sedans that are licensed. So again, this amendment would maintain the status quo for Uber while providing that they may operate legally pending any potential future action from the committee in November after the hearing. So I'd like to move this along with my other members and any time that they have to speak to it.
So, Mr. Evans, this is a second-degree amendment, and to be clear, this is a new Section 20M-C.
I asked the General Counsel, is that correct? That's correct.
Okay, discussion on this second-degree amendment. Councilmember Cheh?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Since the purpose of this is to maintain the status quo while the committee gears up for its hearing in November, I was wondering if Councilmember Evans would accept a sunset provision on this so that we can be clear that this is not the end of the story.
But why would we want to sunset it?
Because, I want to signal that this is just a bridge amendment until we can have a hearing and figure out what's appropriate. Because, when you're saying that it's not subject to any other regulation, you do have the limits that I had put in the bill, and I'm happy about that. The estimated fare, et cetera. But there were some other issues created with Uber's operation. For example, there were instances where during a certain period of the year, rates went sharply up, and there were complaints. If it says estimated fare, maybe we should have some opportunity for people to be able to complain about how they are behaving, et cetera. And I'm just a little uncomfortable to have this put out there as the state of the world forever. So I'm just asking if you'd be willing to accept a sunset provision.
Well, Councilmember Cheh, my concern with having a sunset provision is it will put us right back to where we are today again. So I think everything you want to accomplish, you can accomplish without a sunset provision. If you have your hearing in November and want to make any changes from there. But if we do sunset it, then it puts us right back here again. So I would prefer not to do a sunset.
Well, I can't move that because it would be a tertiary amendment.
Right.
So, all right.
But Councilmember Cheh, if this amendment is adopted, then that amendment would be in order. Were you done, Councilmember Cheh?
Yes.
Councilmember Berry?
Mr. Chairman, this whole area Uber is very, very troubling to most of us on the council. What you have is a San Francisco-based company that operates in a district and probably other places in the suburbs where a person can call with a limousine service. It's my understanding that the fare is 3 or 4 times that of a regular taxi. And so what this company is doing is having a great dent on DC taxi drivers. We have about 5,600 drivers, hardworking people, have no retirement, no health benefits, no Social Security to count on, no sick leave, no annual leave. And yet we're going to impose another barrier to them making money. I oppose the whole amendment. I would have been more comfortable with the sunset, maybe, but I want to put in perspective how this city government and this council, with these kinds of amendments, particularly this one, is putting a great dent on the drivers who drive. Here's a company unregulated. Mr. Evans, I don't understand how you could do this. How you could have a company unregulated, and Mr. Linton, I think I've heard him say this, that they ought to be regulated. The chair of the commission says that. And yet, Mr. Evans, you come with something that, I'm going to tell you, it is upsetting to me and the drivers. I talked to some of the drivers that were across at Freedom Plaza. I'm a friend of the taxi industry, have always been. They've been a political friend of mine. And these drivers were outraged about this, Mr. Evans. And so I'm going to vote against it. I'm going to speak against it. I'm going to tell them what you did and everything else we can do. Yeah, oh yeah. I'm not a snitch now. But seriously,
What happened to that? Yeah.
here's an unregulated industry. The drivers already have a hard time. They cannot pick up passengers at Dulles Airport. Washington Flyer has that business. They can only take someone to the airport, has to come back without a passenger. Same thing with BWI, Mr. Chairman. Washington Flyer, bought some flyer, has that contract. And so our drivers, who are barely making it, as it is, are being punished again. So I'm going to vote against this. I urge all of us, and I urge Ms. Cheh particularly, to vote against this because it goes against the spirit of this bill. The spirit of the bill is to improve the taxi service, to bring some order to some of the disorder, to increase reliability on fares, how much it costs us, and to make this industry an integral part of this hospitality industry.
Mr. Berry, your time has expired.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'm finishing up. Can I have one more minute? And one more minute is,
Without objection.
without objection. You know, we had these heated debates. I don't watch the clock, like some of us, but and you got to put all this together with the Disability Act and et cetera. So on this particular one, vote no.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. Mr. Graham?
I think there's an important point that needs to be emphasized, and I see Mr. Linton, Chairperson Linton, is in the audience, and you can shout out if I'm wrong. But he has told us that the current operation is illegal in the District of Columbia. It's illegal. Now, I'm not saying it's illegal. He's saying it's illegal. The Taxi Cab Commission is saying it's illegal. And so that is the immediate situation in terms of having to respond to that. I think we had worked out, and I credit you, Mr. Evans, and Chairperson Cheh, for your work on this. We have worked out a reasonable accommodation, which is to take it out of the bill, have a separate bill, have a hearing, so that all of us can figure out just exactly what the dynamics are of this, present and future, and move from there. But now we have this open-ended, which I think is a mistake, open-ended, in effect excusing this whole operation from regulation on the basis of what? I mean, who on this dais really is expert on what is going on or what could be going on? Mr. Evans, I think, and as soon as this passes or doesn't pass, I don't know whether it will pass or not pass, we should have an amendment to sunset this exactly as Councilmember Cheh has suggested, because this should not be open-ended. We're taking, this is an interim period. Reasonable people are saying, okay, let's pause, let's figure this out, and let's go from there. But I'm not prepared to
When would you sunset it?
You sunset it in November, huh?
December
Or
31st?
December 31st.
Well, what happens if it sunsets and
Well,
nothing happens?
well, but we would want to act before that.
Well, how do we know you're going to?
Excuse me, do you want to
Oh, no,
talk?
but these are reasonable, these are reasonable
Do you want
questions.
Mr. Chairman, and other to be no decorum? Is there to be no rules here anymore?
Speech.
It is a speech. This is a legislative body. You give speeches. But anyway, I think we've got to have this good faith pause and then figure it out and then realize what we're doing. I mean, it was only a matter of months ago where some of us found out what this was. What it was all about. I don't know whether you're an expert on this, but what we have in the bill is regulation of sedans. We need regulation of sedans. We have limousines regulated, we have taxi cab regulated. We're right now toughening the regulations on taxi cabs, and to some extent on limousines. And so why are we taking this other segment of the industry and saying, you have no regulation at all?
All right. All right. Okay. Why don't you,
Councilmember, are you done, Mr. Graham?
why don't you let me?
Councilmember Alexander, please.
Thank you, Chairman Mendelson. I was one of those, Councilmember Graham, that did not know what Uber was, and I'm learning now what it is. So, Councilmember Cheh, I am leaning towards supporting your measure to take everything out so that we can all get a full understanding, and they do need some regulation because they are acting as a taxi limo in a sense. So I will definitely support you. There is one point that I want to note, what a lot of persons have told me who use Uber, and this is something for the taxi industry to listen to. Uber does come east of the river without hesitation. When someone calls Uber, they are there. And we have some limited service East River when it comes to taxi service. So for that portion, for that fact that Uber does come out, then I really do support them, and I do want to support them in this industry. For the taxi cab industry that is in this chamber, you need to really take note to what Uber is doing, because they have no hesitation going East River. I do feel they need regulation, and I do feel they deserve a full hearing on this matter. So I don't want, Councilmember Evans, I do appreciate this measure, but it seems like it will relieve Uber permanently of any regulation whatsoever. So at this time, I cannot support that, Councilmember Cheh. I do support your measure to take everything out, and then we can come up with a comprehensive, sensible regulation for this new transportation system. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Alexander. Councilmember Evans?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, you can see where the votes are falling on this, and I think it's very important that we do have a regulation that allows them to operate. So, talking with Councilmember Cheh and Graham, why don't we have a sunset as of December 31st of this year? I would say this with the caveat, this would not be part of the law, though, if the council has not acted by the sunset, that the sunset would then be extended for an additional period of time. Because I don't want to find ourselves in a position of having a sunset, nothing happens, and then Uber all of a sudden becomes illegal again, if you see what I'm saying. Because that wouldn't be fair. So there's a give and take here. So I have to operate under the presumption that you're going to do something. But if something's not done, then what do we do at that point? So I'm willing to accept a sunset of December 31st with the stipulation that if we don't act, it would be extended for an additional period.
Right, so the amendment that's before us, Mr. Evans, that you moved, would have the sunset of December 31st added, with the understanding that if the council doesn't act, we would then act to extend it.
Correct.
Mr. Catania?
Mr. Chairman, there's a lot of us that have not spoken first.
You are,
You know,
I don't
but
believe Mr.
these individuals are
Catania.
going the second
Mr.
time.
Catania has not
Third
spoken.
time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be supporting, obviously, the amendment that I helped co-author with Mr. Wells, Mr. Michael Brown, and Mr. Evans. Uber is an exciting new service that is offered to the residents of our city. It is one that I have used, and I believe that it is one that will be increasingly used. Mr. Chairman, we should be embracing more of this mobility technology and not less of the technology. Ms. Alexander mentioned the service has been demonstrated its willingness to go east of the river. It offers a lot of elements and a lot of competition that I think, candidly, the taxi industry would be wise to embrace. If regulation meant high-quality service at a good value, then the District of Columbia would have the best taxi service in the nation, because certainly no one beats us when it comes to regulation. Now, naturally, the chairman of the Taxi Cab Commission would like to have authority over everything to do with Uber, and that's why I suspect he is present here today. But I suspect if we did a better job of regulating our taxi industry, if they provided a good product at a good price, they would have nothing to fear from Uber. The fact that people are willing to pay more for Uber demonstrates something. When you call Uber on your phone, they are there within minutes. You rate them, and they rate you. You actually rate the driver. Was the car clean? Was it air conditioned? Was there a proper accommodation made for you? And actually the driver gets to rate you. Were you a pleasant customer? Et cetera, et cetera. Imagine that, the last time you stepped into a district taxi. Now, I don't want to malign all of our taxi drivers. We have some very good ones. But the fact of the matter is there's incomparability when you talk about the service that you get with Uber and the service you get with a garden variety taxi. Now, why in the world would we want to deprive our residents of a service that they are clamoring for? What is the purpose behind killing Uber if so many of our residents are embracing it? I used it just last week, late at night after the 4th of July. I was in a community where I wasn't, to be perfectly honest, very comfortable standing out front waiting for the possibility that a cab might drop by. I just wasn't. You use the service, the car comes to you and drops you off at your house for a good price, a good product. Why would we want to deprive our residents of that opportunity? Is it a powerful industry? Is it because we don't like it? I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense. The notion that regulation equals quality or that regulation equals better just isn't true. Good regulation, consistently and fairly administered, that doesn't squash an industry is good. Were that only the case here? Mr. Chairman, I'll be supporting this amendment along with the sunset. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Catania. Mr. Orange?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I will not be supporting this amendment. And the reasons why I will not be supporting this amendment is because, how does this affect the D.C. residents that are driving cabs here in the District of Columbia? In terms of competition, pure competition, you're providing an unfair advantage to one group of people and then not providing the same advantage to the others. Now, reading this fiscal impact statement, the only conditions are that the business provides an estimated fare at the time of booking, provide the method for calculating fare structure at the time of booking, provide a receipt upon completion of the trip, listing the pickup point, drop-off point, and total fare paid, and use sedans that are licensed. But what about tax revenue for the D.C. citizens? These D.C. Taxi cab drivers, they're subject to taxation. Why isn't there a condition here that you're subject to taxation? When you're saying that the D.C. residents are going to be denied something, yeah, you're right. We're going to be denied revenue. We're going to be denied regulations to regulate this industry. And in terms of dispatching, we already have a dispatch system in the District of Columbia. You can call up a dispatch service and get a taxi cab. You can call up a dispatch service and get a wheelchair accessible vehicle. So at the end of the day, I'm going to support Councilmember Cheh and her ideal of having a hearing in November to let's really examine the Uber and see what are the benefits, what are the pros and the cons, and give the tax industry, especially those that have been driving cabs for 10, 20, 30 years, an opportunity to come in and present their side of the story. Right now, it's one-sided. having a hearing in November to let's really examine the Uber and see what are the benefits, what are the pros and the cons, and give the tax industry, especially those that have been driving cabs for 10, 20, 30 years, an opportunity to come in and present their side of the story. Right now, it's one-sided. Having a hearing in November to let's really examine the Uber and see what are the benefits, what are the pros and the cons, and give the tax industry, especially those that have been driving cabs for 10, 20, 30 years, an opportunity to come in and present their side of the story. Right now, it's one-sided. Having a hearing in November to let's really examine the Uber and see what are the benefits, what are the pros and the cons, and give the tax industry, especially those that have been driving cabs for 10, 20, 30 years, an opportunity to come in and present their side of the story. Right now, it's one-sided. Having a hearing in November to let's really examine the Uber and see what are the benefits, what are the pros and the cons, and give the tax industry, especially those that have been driving cabs for 10, 20, 30 years, an opportunity to come in and present their side of the story. Right now, it's one-sided. Having a hearing in November to let's really examine the Uber and see what are the benefits, what are the pros and the cons, and give the tax industry, especially those that have been driving cabs for 10, 20, 30 years, an opportunity to come in and present their side of the story. Right now, it's one-sided.
On the table is one that I can support. But I do think that we have to continue to ask the question of what separates the Uber service from a taxi cab, okay? And if the Uber service is a taxi cab, we got to treat it like a taxi cab. And that's the question. And I don't think that any of the taxi cab drivers, I'm not here representing the Cappies, taxi cab drivers, or Uber. I represent the residents of Ward 4. And they need to be able to get a quality ride and have that service available to them. So over this next several months, until this bill, if this amendment should pass and it sunsets, we have to ask and answer that question. Is Uber a taxi cab? If they're a taxi cab and they're a taxi service, guess what? It's a lot of new stuff that taxi cabs in the District of Columbia have to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Bowser. Mr. Berry, you had a point of information.
Information to Mr. Evans. Did you accept Ms. Cheh's amendment to sunset this on December 31st?
In effect, I did, but I didn't.
Not in effect. I mean, did you do it or not? Yeah.
Well, Mr. Barry, if you'd let me finish without interrupting me.
Thank you.
My amendment was a second-degree amendment, so she could not amend my amendment. However, I accepted her suggestion and incorporated it into my amendment. So, yes, the effect is yes.
It's legal.
Yes,
and
it's
lawful.
legal, yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, the motion that's before us is the amendment that says, it's printed, it says a new Section 8, but that's actually 20MC, and then the text is paragraph 1, and then there's a new paragraph 2, which is sunset December 31st, 2012. And when Mr. Evans accepted it, he accepted it with the understanding that if the council takes no action this fall, then it's expected that that sunset would be continued. Councilmember Wells?
You'd have to vote on it.
I'll support the amendment with the sunset. And in that time, what we need to look at is that Uber has a business model that works for the citizens of the District of Columbia. That if I walked out of the building right now to hail a taxi, and if I don't have enough cash in my pocket, most taxis at this time is not going to be able to take my debit card or my credit card, and I won't be able to get a taxi until I can get to an ATM machine or something like that. With Uber, you are guaranteed to be able to use your credit card. If I'm wanting to reserve a car and to be able to get across town, that the dispatch system is reliable, and you can get to Southeast and get other parts of the city reliably and within a period of time that's expected that is reasonable. And so with that business model, if Uber is doing that and charging, a rate that works, we need to look at for our own taxi system of why we can't have the same level of quality in 21st century technology in our taxis. And so I think that between now and December 21st, if it's too much regulation, if we do too much to prevent the taxis system from being able to have basic technology that's been there for 20, 30 years, then let's figure it out. Why are the regs preventing the taxi system from being able to evolve into one that works in a reliable way to where you always don't have to have a bunch of cash in your pocket in order to take a taxi? So with that, I will support the amendment, and I think that we have some work to do between now and the 31st. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Wells. Councilmember McDuffie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say as well, I'll be supporting Councilmember Evans' amendment with the sunset provision. And I will tell you, over the course of the last day or so, I've gotten a number of emails and tweets from folks who have told me they've supported Uber. And they've told me they've supported Uber, and they use it because it's reliable, because it comes to every section of Ward 5, when they've had times when they have not been able to get reliable service from the taxi cab industry. And I think that is a very important point that we need to consider. But we also need to consider the question that Councilmember Bowser asked. Are they operating as cabs or are they operating as limousine services? I think it's important that we tackle this issue and try to figure it out, because I know just from doing my own research over the last 24 hours that Uber has launched a UberX service that they're offering in other cities, where the cost of getting an Uber vehicle is going to be much less than the $15 minimum fare that people are paying now. And so if the cost is much less than the $15 fare that people are paying now, I imagine it's going to be more of a direct competitor with the taxi cabs. And so the question then becomes, if it's more direct in competition with the taxi cabs, should we treat them like taxi cabs? And so that's just some of the questions that I have that I'd love to be able to explore as we have some time in the hearing in November, and I look forward to doing so. But I will be supporting the amendment by Councilmember Evans with the sunset provision. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McDuffie. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, will be obviously supporting the amendment with the sunset as one of the co-introducers. I tell you, this is a great commercial for Uber. For folks that didn't know about Uber before, they sure know about them now. I do want to clear up a couple of things that have been said, I think, both in the blogosphere and otherwise. When I was chair of the taxi cab committee for a little while, 92% of drivers in the DC taxi system, now this was about 2 or 3 years ago, but 92% of our drivers did not live in the District of Columbia. And one of the things we worked on, hopefully those numbers have improved, but one of the things we were trying to work on, we're trying to get some training opportunities for our folks, DC residents, to become drivers in our DC taxi cab system. Hopefully that number has improved, but I know some folks, again, on the blogosphere and otherwise have been talking about how many people live in DC, and if it's still 92% that live outside of the District of Columbia, clearly we still have a lot of work to do. And then in closing, Mr. Chairman, competition is good. We do live in a free market society, and competition is a good thing. Clearly, a lot of our residents clearly care about the service, and still a lot of our residents also use the taxi cab system. And I think that's one of the good things about competition and free market systems. So I'll be supporting the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. The motion is the amendment that Mr. Evans has spoken to. Mr. Orange?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, through you to Councilmember Cheh. Councilmember Cheh, is the sunset provision of December 31st, would that provide you enough time to straighten all this out and have a hearing in November and have a couple readings and get all this put to bed in less than 60 days, rather?
Probably not, but it does put some time period to make this urgent, and I'm prepared to do as much as I can. Even while we're sitting here, I'm thinking maybe I'll move up the hearing date.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I just want to end by saying, yes, competition is good, but fair competition is better. So if I have to go fight somebody and they want me to tie my arm behind my back and I got to fight you with one arm and the other person has two, then that's not fair competition. And that's how I see this. But I'm going to, go with the majority here and work with Councilmember Cheh to see if we can really examine this and make sure that we do achieve fair competition.
Thank you, Mr. Orange. The motion is the amendment that Mr. Evans circulated and spoke to, which has been amended, which also has on it the sunset of December 31st, 2012.
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, God. My God.
Mr. Graham.
Could you call on me?
Yeah, I see this, well, you have to have a minute to read these things. This is about to become law, in the District of Columbia, maybe. Your final paragraph, point 4, says the business providing the mobile application uses sedans that are licensed.
Took the battery out.
What does that mean, licensed?
What? It means licensed. No. It means licensed limo drivers.
Well, then I think you should say licensed limo drivers, because if you're now, although I think that does raise the question of whether or not then it would be subject to the limousine regulations,
Sedan drivers.
Well, there are no licenses. See, that's the whole point, is the sedans presently are not licensed. This bill, if it were to pass, would put into place ultimately a regulatory scheme for sedans. But that's not in place at the moment. And so I don't know what this means.
Mr. Graham, what this means is we're trying to get from here, July 10th to December 31st, in which time Councilmember Cheh is going to examine this whole thing and help and hopefully figure it all out. But what this does, or is intended to do, what this is intended to do is to put the status quo in place so that Uber continue to operate, because without this, they're operating illegally. Mr. Linton went out and arrested people from Uber several months ago because they were operating illegally. He was told not to do that. But without this amendment, they will be operating illegally again. That's all this is intended to do, is to buy some time to get us from here to there. That's it. Now, we can nitpick this thing to death if you want to do that. But this is the best we could do in the time that we had to get this done, because I, like you, have received over 5,000 emails from people who use this service. So we're just trying to accommodate our residents.
5,000 emails.
5,000
Can I
emails.
reclaim my time?
Yeah.
5,000 emails. I know I've heard from a lot of people who very sincerely are interested in this service. And I've heard from them, and I'm impressed by the argument they make, but I've still got to understand what your law is, because your fourth point here is a condition of the excuse from regulation. And so if there is no sedan licensure, your whole amendment
Mr. Graham,
fails.
Thank you
Is that
for,
what you want?
thank you for your comments. Now we can
The whole
vote, and
of-
you
the
can
whole
vote no.
amendment fails.
Then you vote no.
Mr. Evans, Mr. Evans, and Mr. Graham, procedurally where we are is we have this amendment to Councilmember Cheh's amendment, and after we dispose of this amendment, we then have to take up Councilmember Cheh's amendment, and then we have the bill. So there are probably 5 to 10 minutes to be very optimistic before there's a final vote. So if there's a correction to the language, there's some time to correct that. Councilmember Cheh.
Yes, Mr. Evans, I believe, and you can check me on this, you have copied the limitations that you put in there from what I had in the bill initially, correct? Well, the item number 4 has been conflated a little bit. It says the sedans operating this service are, this is a requirement. The sedans operating this service are licensed and comply with the requirements of this section, namely the sedans, the operator has to have a certain permit, and so, but the sedans operating the service are licensed and comply with the requirements of this section. So if you were copying, which, you know, I guess I didn't read it closely enough, I just assumed you copied what I had in there, but you didn't copy it quite fully.
Councilmember Cheh, do you think that we can proceed with the amendment before us while this language gets worked out?
I'm sorry?
Do you think we can proceed with the amendment before us while this language gets worked out?
Well, no, aren't we on the amendment, and this is part of it?
Again, after we dispose of Mr. Evans' amendment, we then have your full amendment. And
Right,
after
but we
your
can't
full
get-
amendment, we have the bill.
Right, but we can't get to my amendments or the full bill until we deal with Mr. Evans' amendment, correct?
Well, I was sort of thinking of some parallel processing here, that you all are working on refining the language while we can at least get this amendment disposed of.
Well, I don't know about the,
Councilmember Cheh, I'll use your language. I mean, is there a difference? Does your language make a difference?
No.
And does it impede the ability of this service to operate? If it doesn't impede the ability of this service to
Right,
operate, then let's take your language.
okay, fine, it just prevents them from being
All right,
licensed in
your language is
Maryland
fine.
and Virginia.
But does that somehow, it prevents Maryland and Virginia from operating here?
As
Well, then
sedans.
Well, then it impedes the service from working. That's the whole point of buying time between now and then. Your language would make Uber illegal. And that's what we're trying to stop from happening in this
No.
3-month time period.
They have to be, the sedans is a new class of service.
I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying, if we use your language, Uber as it operates today cannot operate.
Well, I don't think that's correct.
Then what's the difference? Well, then use my language.
In fact,
Then why not you just use my language?
because I don't think the sedans should be from Virginia and Maryland. I think they should be from the district.
But they are now from Virginia, Maryland.
I don't know what the numbers are on that, but they
But
should.
some are.
Maybe some are.
Yeah, so under your language, they wouldn't able.
There would be a restriction, that's right.
Yeah, exactly, and we're trying not to do that until you finish your review by.
No, but even Uber, out there in California unleashed its fury not over this, but rather over the minimum fare and the minimum
Right.
charges. So they were okay with this.
I don't know that they were okay with this or not, but I assume if you put a restriction in place, you will get another 4,000 emails tomorrow. And my point
I have
is,
capacity on my phone.
my point is not that. My point is, why don't we just put in place the status quo, get from here to December 31st, and then you can make all your adjustments. I don't know what you're concerned about is going to happen between today and December 31st.
The member's time has expired. I would like to propose that we proceed with this amendment, and then when we have the underlying amendment before us, there continues to be some wordsmithing. Ms. Cheh, I pass some word to you through your staff.
I'm sorry, I was listening to Mr. Graham.
I suggest that we proceed to vote on this amendment, and that...
You mean the Evans amendment?
Yes, and that we then have the underlying amendment. Maybe I'm wrong, that there's no discussion or interest in any other part of it. And maybe there is something.
Mr. Mendelsohn,
That we can work on the language.
Chairman, I have some concerns.
We could work
I have
on the
some amendments,
language
too.
and fix it then.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Berry, on this amendment?
No, I said, you made a statement that you think there'll be other discussions.
Good.
I said,
Excellent.
That's not true.
So can we proceed to a vote on this
Mr. Chairman,
amendment?
on this amendment, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, would it be more appropriate for Mr. Evans to pull his amendment back and work out the language, and then let us vote on something that we know we're voting on? Right now, you're asking us to vote on something that's flawed, and then say, let's correct it by the end of this discussion. Why don't the parties, the officers, get together and work out the language, so when we vote on something that we can all vote on? I would hate to vote on a flawed amendment. Mr. Graham has a very significant point, and Councilmember Cheh has also indicated there's a problem with the sedans. So why don't they?
As I said, I think we're very close on this. There's just a little bit of language that needs to be worked on, and there's an understanding that number 4 needs to be worked on.
Right.
So,
could they pull it and work on that?
Mr. Chairman?
well, then we're not working on it. Mr. Brown,
Can we just call the question at this time, Mr. Chairman?
is that a motion to call the question?
Motion to call the question.
Okay, the motion to call the question is not debatable. If it's approved, anybody who's not spoken is allowed to speak. All those in favor of the motion to call the question, say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Is there anybody who wishes to speak who's not spoken on this? Okay, then on the amendment, which Mr. Evans has spoken to, again, it has a sunset added to it. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
No.
The ayes have it unanimously. We have the underlying... I'm sorry, I misspoke. The ayes have it, and not unanimous. The underlying amendment is before us. Mr. Berry. Mr. Berry.
Mr. Chairman, in terms of the underlying amendment, substitute amendment, I want to congratulate Ms. Cheh for dealing with a situation which should have been dealt with long ago. There is reform of our taxi cab industry. There's a lot of debates about Uber and the DC taxis. I want to make it very clear. Our taxi drivers, hard-working, we need to reform that system too. Reform their attitude in some of it. And this doesn't apply to everybody. But I mean, I ride taxis myself.
You're doing the right thing.
But obviously I'm treated differently than the average person because of my position. We ought to make it possible, Mr. Chairman, for every DC resident to be able to get a quality ride. Cabs come on time when they say they're coming, and the fare is reasonable, etc. I've had experiences myself. I live in the Southeast, everybody knows that, the Washington Post told you that. But just last about 3 or 4 months ago, I had a friend of mine who was from Birmingham. He was visiting me. And he stayed till about 11:30, 12 o'clock. And he wanted a cab. I called. I'm not going to name the cab company because I don't want to do that. Told him who I was. It took an hour to get that cab. Now, I didn't report it to the commission, but I wasn't interested in doing it that way. So it's obvious that the cab industry, you drivers, we love you to death, but you've got to also improve the delivery of services. And I live in Southeast where it is hard to get a cab. Coming over there, it's almost impossible to call a cab and get out of there in a reasonable amount of time. So what I'm making, Ms. Cheh, we need reform. In terms of competition, as Mr. Orange said, we need fair competition. If another service is better than another service, if it's fair, more power to the one who got a better service. The goal is for our citizens to have that. Now, I have an amendment, Mr. Chairman. There's been a lot of debates about the revenue and et cetera. I have an amendment which requires monthly revenue reports. I've discussed with Mr. Met, he supports it. I've discussed with Dr. Gandhi, he supports it. And so that way we can stop this debate about whether or not there's accurate information and not accurate information. And we can do that. I'd like to move this, Mr. Chairman. Can we all circulate this? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. Mr. Wells?
Thank you very much. I have an amendment that I'm sorry. I'm not sure why you called on me, Mr. Chair, but it was kind of you. I will wait until Mr. Berry's amendment is dealt with.
Mr. Chairman, can I just add a little bit to this? It seems to me that there's not any opposition from the administration, and if that's the case, we ought to get this information, because there has been a debate about whether or not there's $8.9 million coming in or 5.4 coming in. This will solve all of that, which means if the money is not coming in at the rate they say so, we can demand that the mayor and the CFO develop a plan to get it in. So I think we ought to just vote.
Mr. Berry, I apologize. I did not realize you had circulated an amendment. You have an amendment number 1 that the commission shall submit to the council monthly revenue reports, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the discussion is on that.
Yes, sir.
Is there further discussion with regard to Mr. Berry's amendment? Again, Mr. Berry's amendment is the commission shall submit to the council monthly revenue reports on the fund by the 15th of every month. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Mr. Wells.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to propose an amendment that I hope Councilmember Cheh will take as friendly. I understand that many taxi drivers have concerns about privacy related to GPS systems. They're concerned about their own privacy and that of their customers. However, I'm also advised that we may be able to overcome these concerns by making the data anonymous. Real-time information on taxi location availability has the potential to be invaluable to customers, particularly if the universe of creative phone app developers have access to such data. I'd like to amend the bill to require that the Taxi Cab Commission provide an assessment to the Council in 60 days of the effective date of this Act regarding the feasibility of making data collected from taxi GPS system publicly available and anonymous in an anonymous format for the purpose of developing software tools that may be useful to taxi customers. So move, Mr. Chair. Well, if through the chair, if
It's acceptable.
thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
There was no objection to this amendment? All right. The amendment is accepted. Further discussion on the bill. Mr. Orange.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few amendments. Hopefully they will be accepted as friendly. The first amendment would amend this bill to, and it states a taxi cab may transport several passengers to different locations provided
Mr.
that
Orange,
the
let me
original.
interrupt you for a second. We have Ms. Cheh's amendment, and you're not amending her amendment.
No, I'm
Now, I
not.
did just take a couple other amendments that were not objectionable. I don't know whether yours is or not. Why don't we dispose of Ms. Cheh's amendment and then take you up?
Okay, well, can we, since we've passed it out, can we at least see if does she object to this one?
Well, but we still have an amendment on the floor.
I
and-
probably will, because I think we should leave that up to the commission.
Okay.
So if you don't mind, they can distribute the amendment, members shouldn't lose it. Let's finish with Councilmember Cheh's amendment.
All right.
Further discussion on Councilmember Cheh's amendment, as it has been amended?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do have some questions on
Yes, Mr. Orange.
number 2. This is section, it says section 20HC, page 30, and this where it amends to say that each fleet shall have 6% wheelchair accessible by December 31st, 2014. It goes up to 12% by December 31st, 2016, and then at least 20% by December 2018. Through you to Councilmember Cheh, is there a financing mechanism available for these taxi cab companies to implement this particular provision? My calculations based on a taxi cab company having 100 taxi cabs and 6% of that by December 31st, 2014 means that they would have to make a $240,000 investment to purchase 6 wheelchair accessible cabs, assuming that the price is in the neighborhood of $40,000. Then by December 31st, 2016, they would have had to make a $480,000 investment. And then by the year 2018, overall, the total investment will be $800,000 to have 20 wheelchair-accessible vehicles based on a company having a fleet of 100. Are there any companies out there available that would finance this type of operation?
Through the chair, Mr. Orange, part of the amendment provides that the Disability Taxi Cab Advisory Committee and the Chief Financial Officer and the Commission, that they're to develop a program to provide grants, loans, or other types of financial assistance and incentives to offset the cost of buying or retrofitting or maintaining wheelchair-accessible cabs. Some of that money will be coming out of the 50-cent surcharge. And in addition, we're hoping that additional money will be made available. We anticipate a significant amount of money to have wheelchair-accessible taxis be able to do metro access at a much cheaper cost, and having a contract that will provide a certain percentage of that work to the accessible cabs will give them a foundation for borrowing as well.
However, Councilman Cheh, I believe at this time, the feasibility statement indicates that was $8.9 million would be available. And in looking at the bill, if this has not been amended, it indicates that funds deposited into this fund shall be used by the costs incurred by the commission. And then the paragraphs 2, 3, and 4 says may be used for the other items that you articulated. But I thought it was, overall this bill is about a $30 million bill. So how could each one of these companies get financed to the tune of $800,000? I mean, where would the other revenue come from?
Well, as I indicated, first of all, it's a fairly conservative estimate, and it is each year that we'll be getting that money. My estimate, or the estimate that they're giving me of the operations of the commission, are about $4 million. Is that right? That's what we understand, $4 million. So right there you have almost, another $4 or $5 million that would be available from the surcharge, and this would be every year. And then in addition to that, there will be an opportunity to replace Metro Access for those who are wheelchair only. Obviously, if you have people with different problems, they won't be able to use that. We anticipate an MOU with WMATA on that point. And then finally, if we can get, and this is down the road a little bit, we're also thinking about the prospect of transporting students as well.
Mr. Orange, your term has expired.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer an amendment on this section of the bill. And basically what it states is that no taxi cab owner shall be financially responsible for the cost of the modernization of taxi cabs in accordance with this section until the district can identify a financial entity or entities willing to offer loans and lines of credits based on this particular section of having these wheelchair accessible vehicles. I mean, this is a significant burden to place on these companies without providing them any type of assistance.
Mr. Chairman?
Is that in writing, and do you have a fiscal impact statement with that?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
While that's circulating, if I could respond.
Mr. Orange, you're circulating your amendment now?
Yes.
Councilmember Cheh and then Mr. Berry.
Yes, again, in the bill, on or before next February 15th, this special committee is going to send a report to the council and with recommendations, and among those include a description of the types of grants, loans, tax credits, and other types of financial assistance and incentives that could be provided to the taxi cab companies, et cetera, to offset the costs or to assist with the costs, so that we are anticipating providing assistance in that regard. And if your amendment were to be adopted, it would basically kill this bill. And I don't know if that's intended, but that would be the effect.
Well, Councilman Cheh, I believe that my amendment is consistent with what you just indicated. My amendment simply states that, it doesn't knock out your provisions, it just says that once we have identified financing that's available, then this requirement, to meet these requirements that you've outlined, then the taxi cab owners would have to do that. But it's my understanding when this whole bill came about is that there would not be any short costs to the taxi cab drivers, and if there were going to be additional vehicles, that there would be opportunity for the government to provide financing or at least access to financing, and that's simply what this amendment states. This will basically come into effect when the district can identify, and that's what you're saying, your commission will identify grants, loans, and other areas of financing for these owners to meet these requirements.
Well, again, if you think it's all the same, then we don't need your amendment, so.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Berry. Mr. Berry.
Yes, sir. Let me, and I've talked to Ms. Cheh about this on several occasions. We all believe that these vans ought to be handicap accessible. We have to. It's moral right, it's right to do. And the question I raised with her, who's going to pay for it? And then she said to me, the owner of these associations would bear the expense. And I said, well, do you realize that it's between $13,000, $15,000 a van? She said, yes. And so, Mr. Chairman, the reason Mr. Owen is doing this is not that he likes these owners or anything else, but we don't want to financially run these owners out of business. I'll give you one example. Everybody quotes Jerry Schaefer. Got all these cabs, they're all over the place. We look at the fact, Jerry Schaefer's company only has 180 cabs. So under this bill, he would require eventually 10%, eventually 20%. But just take the 9 that he's talking about. There's no financial institution going to finance equipment vans. There's no financial institution going to finance a new van. Most of these drivers and these associations, the people are members of his association and the 40 other associations, primarily for insurance purposes, primarily for financing purposes. Some of these owners can afford that. And so we have to be very careful when we have a great desirable handicapped vehicles. But don't put the business people out of business what you do. And say, I don't think it's enough just to say they may issue grants, they may do this, they may do that. I think we have to be very mindful of the conditions here. Now, it's obvious that drivers don't have to do this. But then the age situation affects these drivers because they can't get financed every 5 years or 7 years. And so all these burdens are being put on a very valuable industry. People you see sitting over there, they work awfully hard, trying to provide service to our people. And so I support Mr. And Ms. Cheh, I think there's a difference between what you said and what Mr. Orange is trying to do. And so it seems to me that there's a different opinion. You got to tell us why it's different. And this is not personal, it's programmatic. These owners, and I only know a few of them, and they're not political friends of mine, they're just hard-working business people.
Mr. Berry, your time's expired.
Yeah. Could I ask Ms. Cheh a question?
Your time's expired.
Mr. Chairman, you can ask a question.
Sure you can, but you chose to ask the question at the end of your round, and we've been on this bill for about an hour and a half already.
Well, but that's no reason that we should limit it, but I'll talk about that later.
Mr. Brown?
Every chairman I've known has had some flexibility about this club.
Mr. Brown.
Motion to call the question, Mr. Chairman.
And a motion to call the question, the effect of which is that anybody who has not spoken would be allowed to speak. I believe the motion is not debatable. All those in favor of the motion to call the question say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Anybody who's not spoken will be recognized. Mr. Catania, did you ask to be recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't be supporting this amendment because it essentially frustrates one of the most important elements of the bill, which is to permit and facilitate non-cash payments for taxi cab fares. In other words, the use of credit cards. Until such time, according to the amendment, as someone is able to come up with loans or lines of credit. I have two reactions. Number one, I think it's a fascinating precedent to require, if this government feels that a certain regulation or a certain law is important, for us to hold that in abeyance until the industry itself determines that it will pay for it or find a way to pay for it, it sends a really odd message. I mean, imagine if we were applying this to health and safety issues, an apartment safety issue, and we said, well, we're going to have these regulations, but we'll only implement it when the owner that would be burdened by it decides to get around finding a way to pay for it. That's an invitation for nothing. That isn't the use of the state's so-called state police powers. This law becomes a suggestion for the industry to decide when and if it does this. Now, preferably, it would be my preference, in all honesty, to let the industry decide for itself in some respects, whether or not individual cab companies just decide for themselves whether or not they want non-cash payments. Some might choose to do it and some might not. And those that decided to do it would be privileged because customers would use them, and those that didn't wouldn't. And eventually, as we gravitate towards a cashless society, those who chose to only have a cash-only system would go out of business. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm of two minds about this, to be honest. I think the amendment, if we are going to state as a public policy, which the bill does, and are going to require taxi cabs to have a non-cash payment, it seems to me we should require that to be the case and not leave it up to the industry. The alternative point of view is to simply not have, to strip this from the bill entirely and allow the market to decide what's the best way for payment to take place within taxi cabs. Let it, if those taxi cabs that want non-cash payments want to do it, let them do it, and if those that don't. I think so long as we don't stifle alternative forms of competition, the discussion we had just a few moments ago with respect to Uber provides a great illustration. Those entities, those companies that compete and embrace technologies and meet the needs of their clients will succeed, and those that hide behind regulation won't, so long as the regulation doesn't kill the competition. But in any event, the amendment before us, Mr. Chairman, essentially leaves it to the industry to decide and regulate itself, and as such, I'm really not inclined to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Catania.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman?
Is it a point of order?
Point of order.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, Councilman Catania's entire dialogue does not speak to the amendment.
That's not a point of order.
But this is not about cash payments. This is real cars.
It's still not a point of, that's not a point of order. You're disagreeing with the substance of what he said.
No, I'm not disagreeing
Point
with
of
the
order
substance.
deals with the procedure, the order of business here.
Well, Mr. Chairman, isn't procedurally, if an amendment is on the floor, then the discussion should be germane to the
Generally, I've
the
been
amendment.
pretty loose about that, and there are quite a number of members who've gone beyond what was on the floor.
But just for the record, this is not about cash payments. I mean, you agree with that. This is not cash payments. This is about the financing of real car accessible vehicles, 6%, 12%, and 20%.
You're arguing the amendment, and that's not in order with a point of order. Is there anybody else who has not spoken on this amendment who wishes to speak? Councilmember Bowser?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have some concerns about this aspect of the bill. Having spent a number of months representing the council on the Transportation Planning Board, when the Transportation Planning Board in in tandem with the commission, rolled out really the pilot program for accessible taxi in the district, Roll DC. And there are a lot of people there who've been working with this issue in the district for many years, who do have some concerns about how we get to, there was a concern about 10%, and now we're up to the 20% mandate for having wheelchair-accessible taxis. Wheelchair-accessible vehicles, there's a significant cost to retrofit these vehicles or buy new vehicles, and the mandates we're setting are ambitious, and we would be far exceed the jurisdictions around us, for example, in terms of the wheelchair available fleet that they have. And so my question to Ms. Cheh, I think I heard you mention that if Mr. Orange's amendment was focused only, and he says it is, on the wheelchair accessibility and linking the mandate for wheelchair accessibility with funds availability, would you accept that?
No, because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get things up and running and at the same time establish some benchmarks. But the background of this is to have this advisory group figure out exactly what we do need. And therefore, and also, the targets are years out. And each year, the 50-cent surcharge is adding to the pool of money that will be available to provide loan guarantees and things of that nature. Also, we'll be able to bring online, the business with Metro Access. We'll also have the opportunity to pursue this possibility with OSSI. I think we need to get this going rather than cement right now and say, you know exactly how much you'll have. Because it's evolutionary, and I think that we have to get started with it. Otherwise, we're back to square one.
Okay, so the amendment that you circulated excludes the associations from the requirement?
That's correct.
And how many companies would this then apply to?
2,200 vehicles total.
Oh, companies.
But how many, are those all independent folks, or are they part of the independent?
2,200 vehicles are owned by companies or owned by companies and then leased, correct?
And then rented to.
And then rented to others.
Okay, so how many companies?
How many companies does that?
I don't know how many companies there are.
Okay.
As Chairman Linton's just sitting there.
Well, I don't know that.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Bowser. Is anybody else who has
I have
not
another
spoken?
amendment, Mr. Chairman.
110, okay.
Mr. Orange?
I have another amendment.
I know, but there's an amendment on the floor, which is your amendment.
Okay.
I would urge members to vote against this amendment. I interpret this amendment as a poison pill to the bill, what it does is it essentially defers the applicability to the bill until some vague financing scheme is achieved. It's not clear how that would be achieved. It is very clear from the discussion, especially as represented by Councilmember Cheh, that there are extensive efforts underway to find financing through the surcharge, for example, and millions of dollars, so that the cost to the drivers will be minimized. Exactly what the cost to the drivers will be is not clear, but it appears that it will be maybe a couple $100s. In any event, there are extensive efforts through the surcharge to pay the costs for the drivers. This amendment would actually set that back and I think make the bill ineffective or meaningless. So again, I would urge members to vote against this amendment. I don't believe anybody else who has not spoken wants to speak. The vote is on this amendment by Mr. Orange. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. No. The noes have it. The motion on the floor is Councilmember Cheh's amendment, which is identified as number 1. Mr. Orange, your last amendment wasn't really to Ms. Cheh's amendment. And so we're operating on a secondary amendments, which is very difficult. Can we please dispose of Councilmember Cheh's amendment, and then we can take up your next amendment?
Well, it's germane to her amendments. This is once again on the wheel car on wheelchair accessible.
Yes,
where-
but are you proposing to amend a particular page in her
Yes.
amendment? In her amendment?
Yes, I'm proposing to add a paragraph D to section 20HC, page 30, which is on her page 2 of her amendment. Now, I did not have this amendment, when I came here, so, but the amendment I have addresses that issue. It's on wheelchair accessible vehicles.
Okay, please distribute it.
I would hope that this one may be accepted as a friendly amendment. This amendment would allow taxi cab companies existing wheelchair accessible vehicles with rear entry ramps or lifts to count towards the bill's requirement at the time 5% of a taxi cab company or accessible fleet is accessible. However, any new wheelchair accessible vehicles that will be purchased will have to have the side entry as opposed to the rear entry into the vehicle.
Is the attempt of your amendment, Mr. Orange, to grandfather, or is that only part of it?
Grandfather. The intent is, the bill would provide that existing wheelchair accessible vehicles with rear entry ramps or lifts are grandfathered in, but any new purchasing of wheelchair accessible vehicles will in fact have the side entrance.
In striking, in A, striking the phrase rear entry, is that striking a prohibition on rear entry?
Only for new vehicles. For anything that's now in operation will be grandfathered in. So all accessible vehicles that now have rear entry, they are grandfathered in.
I understand, that's clear in B, but A seems to strike it for new vehicles.
Well, because the bill as it exists allows both rear entry and side, and I'm striking rear. However, grandfathering in any wheelchair accessible vehicles that have rear entry today.
Councilmember Cheh?
Yes, I wouldn't accept this as a friendly for a variety of reasons. It would wind up limiting the number of wheelchair accessible providers that would be able to provide vehicles in the district. It would eliminate a lower cost rear entry vehicle and limit competition to just those to retrofit vans for side entries or side entry in the future. The vehicles currently in the Roll DC pilot are rear entry vehicles. COG has not indicated any problems with those vehicles. Rear entry vehicles, as I mentioned, are less expensive. They have a safer fuel tank location. It's not located between the rear bumper and the rear axle, but rather the lower floor. Entry is easier in the rear entry vehicle. No turning of the wheelchair or mobility device would be required. And rear entry models can accommodate up to 7 ambulatory passengers, including the driver, when wheelchairs are not in place. Side entry can only seat 5. So I don't see the benefits of this.
Mr. Chairman, if I could reclaim my time, by some in the industry, rear entry is considered to be discriminatory. And the fact that, people have to enter from the rear as opposed to the side considered the front. And that's why today I'm saying let's grandfather in all existing vehicles, but if we're going to be purchasing brand-new wheelchair accessible vehicles that cost about $40,000, the models that have been presented at the auto shows is side entry. Now, you are right, you can get a cheaper one with re-entry, but who wants to enter from the back? It's more dangerous. You can't pull up to the curb and just enter. And as opposed to a rear entry, if there's a car parking, you have to park, there are problems. And so the new vehicles should be something that we should, as a policy, accept on behalf of our disabled population. We have 140,000 disabled individuals, and they should not have to enter from the rear. They should be able to enter same as I do, same as you do. You don't enter from the rear, you enter from the side. And so as a policy moving forward, we want to be progressive. We're just saying that when you're doing your planning for these companies, when you're doing your planning, buy an appropriate wheelchair accessible vehicle.
Further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Berry?
Chairman, I support this amendment because the disability community supports it. I've had a number of conversations with people in the disabled community, and they point out that if you held one of these accessible vehicles in the middle of the block, and then go back to the corner, there's a curb cut, and get off. Whereas if it's on the side, the driver can assist you in getting off. Secondly, look at our Metro Access vehicles. The ones that I've seen, I was on the Metro board for about 3 or 4 years. They are side accessible. I was at church on Sunday, and 2 of those vehicles came to pick up 2 members of Temple of Praise where I go to church. And so that's a good question. Why is it that Metro Access can do this, and this progressive D.C. government can't? So I'd like to ask Cheh, at the hearing on this bill, was there any discussion about side or back? In terms of research, in terms of other cities who have done this, New York and others, what do? Do they have mostly side or mostly rear end? On my time now, while we're getting that.
Through the chair, other cities use both, and the law that, as I've proposed it, would allow use of both, but to tie it into simply this one form or the other will limit competition and will be more expensive, and I think the rear entry has been proven to be safer. In addition to which, we've spent an awful lot of time talking to people in the disability community, and they have not raised this issue or identified it as some sort of discrimination. I think that other cities have done it as our bill would allow it either way.
See, the disability community wants all this. They don't care who pays for it. They're not involved in that discussion at all. They, the ones I've talked to, I said earlier, prefer the side interests. But again, Mr. Orange is trying to break new ground, and I know a lot of opinions already formed against it, but I think we have to speak to it anyway. Also, Mr. Chairman, in terms of the wheelchair situation, back to the expenses. If Jerry Schaefer has to spend $15,000 per vehicle, he gets, just say 10, that's $500,000. The only way he can get his money is to increase the lease on those 10 vehicles. And when he increases the lease, you're not going to have many drivers leasing that, because it means they have to work harder to get the payments up, which means a cruel joke is being played on the disability community. And so I think it's all ought to come together and support Mr. Orange, at least give it a chance. And at the hearing that Ms. Cheh's going to have with that committee on,
Mr. Berry.
you can ask questions about that, and we can always change it.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. Mr. Catania?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I move the previous question.
The motion is to call the question, the effect of which is that if it is passed, anybody who has not spoken is allowed one chance to speak. All those in favor of the motion, the previous question, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. The motion passes. Anybody who has not spoken? All right, the amendment is before us.
A roll call, Mr. Chairman.
The secretary will call the roll.
Councilmember Bowser?
It's on the amendment, EO's amendment.
No, we got to give 2 minutes.
Pretty much.
Let's take 2 minutes for the roll call.
This is on the taxi. This is on the taxi.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Councilmember Alexander.
is it okay if I clarify something, if I can ask a question?
Yes.
With regards to and this is through you to Councilmember Orange, what is the problem? Because if I'm correct, you can either, with the new legislation, you can have a side or a rear entrance. So why would you only limit it for the new ones just having a side entrance?
One, this is what the disability community wants.
What's the rationale?
And the rationale is that they feel it's a lot safer to enter from the side. The vehicle pulls up to the sidewalk and they enter right in, as opposed to, as I think Councilman Berry indicated, sometimes they have to drive back around the corner in order for you to get into the rear. You have to have ample space in order to get in from the rear. So that's why this bill addresses the best of both worlds.
So then why would you grandfather in the ones that have the rear?
Because they only have a useful life. Under this bill, I believe we're only providing a 5 to 7 years, so eventually they're going to go out of service. So what we're saying is we want to have a more modern fleet, a fleet that, that is comparable with the other fleets in the other major jurisdictions. If you go to New York, the 2,000 wheelchair accessible vehicles that the governor has ordered, they will be side door accessible. They will not be rear entry. And that's just modernizing our fleet as we move forward. But the fleets that are currently in operation, clearly we should use them until their useful life is up.
Well, could there be a car that can offer both options? That still wouldn't be.
I'm not aware of one that offers both options. Councilmember Cheh says that would be a golf court. I'm
trying to figure out, if someone is in a wheelchair, they need ample room to enter through a ramp, either side or rear. Well, I'm thinking the rear may have even more space than the side.
No, if they had, in fact, Senator Harkin and others have had demonstrations with the new vehicles, and we've had a demonstration that came here, and the new ones are, in fact, side entry. So it's just a question of what type of fleet you want to have. If you want to, modernize your fleet, you'll go this route. If you don't, then, stay with the antiquated models.
The 2 minutes is up on the, the Secretary will resume the roll call.
Councilmember Brown?
Here. Oh, I'm sorry. Was this on the amended?
The motion is on Mr. Orange's amendment, which deals with strike rear entry and add provided existing wheelchair accessible vehicles with rear entry ramps or lifts are grandfathered in.
No.
Councilmember Brown votes no. Councilmember Catania?
No.
Councilmember Catania votes no. Councilmember Cheh?
No.
Councilmember Cheh votes no. Councilmember Evans?
No.
Councilmember Evans votes no. Councilmember Graham? Councilmember Graham?
No.
It's getting late in the day.
Councilmember Graham votes no. Councilmember McDuffie?
No.
Councilmember McDuffie votes no. Chairman Mendelson?
No.
Chairman Mendelson votes no. Councilmember Orange?
Yes.
Councilmember Orange votes yes. Councilmember Wells?
No.
Councilmember Wells votes no. Councilmember Alexander?
No.
Councilmember Alexander votes no. Councilmember Barry? Councilmember Barry votes yes. Councilmember Bowser? Councilmember Bowser votes no. Mr. Chairman, there are 2 yeses and 10 nos.
The amendment fails. The motion before us again is Councilmember Cheh's amendment number 1. Further discussion on her amendment, which has been amended. All those in favor of the amendment, this is Councilmember Cheh's amendment as amended, I'll say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
The ayes have it.
Please record me as voting no, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Orange will be recorded as voting no on the amendment. We now have the bill before us. Further discussion on the bill. Mr. Berry.
I'd like to make an observation, and that observation is some members of the council, just because I say another member makes an amendment, just automatically says no. And that's not healthy in a democracy, that's all.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. Further discussion? Were you done, Mr. Berry? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, yes,
Yes,
the
Mr.
other amendment that I passed out earlier about the shared writings, and you want to wait until this moment?
Yes, why don't you speak to it? I don't remember seeing it. Do all members have it?
Basically, Mr. Chairman, this amendment would just provide opportunity for taxi cab drivers to have shared passengers. However, it will be up to the original passenger, the one that's in the cab first, to dictate whether or not the taxi cab driver can pick up a second driver that's along that same route.
Councilmember Cheh?
Yes, I don't accept this as friendly. Currently we have shared riding at Nationals Park and Union Station, but that shared riding experience is monitored by a starter at a stand to oversee the process. Multiple passengers get in the cab at the same point, and the meter is restarted at the first destination. Starters prevent potential passengers from trying to enter cabs without permission of the first passenger. It provides the protection for that, and piling into cabs without enough seat belts for the passengers. It won't work with the current meter system when cabs are allowed to stop in the middle of a trip to take on a new passenger or to go to another destination. It would lead, I believe, to mischief and possibly dispute between drivers who want to pick up additional passengers and passengers who do not. I think that this is, in any event, precisely the kind of thing that should be a regulatory matter for the Commission, not the Council. And the Commission is specifically taking up the issue about shared riding, so I would oppose this, and I think it shouldn't be engrafted onto the legislation at this time.
Further discussion on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment? This is Mr. Orange's amendment regarding shared rides. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. No.
Roll call.
There's been a request for a roll call.
Councilmember Brown?
No.
Councilmember Brown votes no. Councilmember Catania?
No.
Councilmember Catania votes no. Councilmember Cheh? Councilmember Cheh votes no. Councilmember Evans? No. Councilmember Evans votes no. Councilmember Graham? Councilmember Graham votes yes. Councilmember McDuffie?
No.
Councilmember McDuffie votes no. Chairman Mendelson?
No.
Chairman Mendelson votes no. Councilmember Orange?
Yes.
Councilmember Orange votes yes. Councilmember Wells?
No.
Councilmember Wells votes no. Councilmember Alexander?
Yes.
Councilmember Alexander votes yes. Councilmember Barry?
Chairman, this is an example I was talking about. In terms of one person makes a motion, and I vote yes.
Councilmember Barry votes yes. Councilmember Bowser?
No.
Councilmember Bowser votes no. Mr. Chairman, there are 8 noes and 4 yeses.
The amendment fails. The bill is before us. Further discussion? The bill is amended. All those in favor of the bill say aye.
Chairman.
Aye. Mr. Barry, in the vote?
Before the vote, in terms of the installation fee, who pays what? I just want to record that last Friday, I was talking with the mayor about this, and on Monday, he indicated to his staff that the city would pick up that, so I just wanted to let everybody know that we pushed that agenda of trying to keep cab drivers from paying more money, and it worked. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barry.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to speak to the overall bill. First of all, I'd just like to thank Councilmember Cheh for putting in the hard work for getting us to this point. Although I disagree with many aspects of the bill, I do think the fact that those who will utilize the taxi cabs will have an opportunity to use their credit cards, debit cards. There'll be a GPS system, and things of that nature will, in fact, be good for the consumer. However, I do believe that this bill has left the D.C. taxi cab drivers out of the bill. There's no new protections for them. There's tremendous costs that they will be incurring for our taxi cab companies. I know Mr. Berry mentioned Mr. Schaefer had 180 taxi cabs. Under this bill, he will have a $1.4 million obligation to go out and purchase wheelchair accessible cars, and there's no financing in this bill whatsoever. The fact that we have 140,000 disabled people here in the nation's capital and they cannot stand on the corner and hail a cab is unfortunate when we're here today saying that we are in fact addressing a taxi cab system and we want to make it one of the best in the nation. Clearly it is not, because it has left out a number of entities that are involved in this system, especially our taxi cab drivers. A lot of them have been driving for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and they will leave out of here today with no more protections than what they had when they walked in. The fact of the matter is when they actually retire, they will not have anything to pass on to their families. The transfer of wealth. We will be able to transfer. We have our retirement plans. We have homes that we can pass on. But these individuals, at the end of 30 days, I mean, it's worse than just getting a little watch. We've done nothing here for them today. And I think that's unfortunate, and we've done nothing here today for our disabled population that guarantees that they can have dignity when they're on the corner and when they're out and they want to hail a cab. We've done nothing for them to give them dignity when they actually have to enter into the cab. It's like, you know, getting on the bus and you got to sit in the back of the bus where they got to enter from the rear. Even going forward, as we talk about modernizing our fleet, we're more concerned about the color of the fleet than about an individual entering the fleet. And, you know, that disturbs me, but, you know, the majority has spoke, and I will continue to work with Councilmember Cheh as she has her hearing in November, and over the summer, hopefully others will examine this bill and see how we can address those entities and individuals that have been left out of this process. And clearly, our D.C. taxi drivers have been left out. Our disabled population have been left out. And if we don't do something, even our treasury is going to be left out, because we're going to wind up paying for all this at the end of the day. For those reasons, I will be voting against this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Orange. Councilmember Cheh.
I just wanted to make an observation. The hearing that I was going to schedule for November, that is already scheduled. I'm going to move that up, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to have a hearing at the end of September, so that if we can come up with some solution, that we'll have time before the end of the council period to pursue it. I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Councilmember Cheh. The motion is on the bill as has been amended. All those in favor of the bill say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
No. Please record me as voting no.
Please record Councilmember Orange as voting no. The bill passes. The next item on the agenda is Bill 19-517, Verizon Center Graphics and Entertainment Act of 2012. Councilmember Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to incorporate